I said recently that I was slowly wading through some of your most popular and routinely requested video ideas, because this is the People's Channel, and I wasn't lying. Today's suggestion comes courtesy of Akinfenwa to the Prem, who has pretty frequently asked me to take a look at 7 of the greatest relegation escapes of all time. Now, there might be some wishful thinking on Mr. Akinfenwa's part, with Wycombe Wanderers currently stranded at the foot of the Championship table, 11 points from safety. But in these dark days, I'm happy to try and provide you with some optimism. It's important to stress that great escapes seem to mean different things to different people. Some people put a huge emphasis solely on the final game of the season and the drama that game entails, whilst others are more interested in the deficit that teams have had to make up, say, having been 14 points off safety on Christmas Day, and then mounting an extraordinary run to make up the necessary ground, and perhaps even securing safety before the final day. Simply put, I'll be taking both into account, possibly with an emphasis on the latter, but ideally a combination of the two. Almost every team in world football has had one great escape among their past, so whittling it down to 7 from the entire world of football is obviously a thankless task. Many great escapes are forced to miss out then, such as the one my own team mounted in the 1998-99 season, when our first half of the season looked like this, and our second half looked like this, as caretaker player-manager Warren Joyce and his cohorts achieved the unthinkable. It's worth noting that we were in the old 3rd division at the time, plagued by financial woes, and relegation into the non-league game might have led to liquidation and the end of the club. So, as you can see, the competition is pretty stiff, and I don't want to pick only English great escapes as well. Without further ado though, here are 7 of the greatest relegation escapes of all time. Carlisle United, 1998-99. I contemplated leaving this one out due to its almost cliched status as the all-time greatest final day escape, but I didn't want to cause riots in the streets of Cumbria, and quite frankly, it was utterly stupendous. Oddly enough, this great escape comes from the same season and in the same league as Hull City's great escape that I just mentioned, and it's probably the reason why the Tigers' 98-99 heroics aren't better remembered outside of East Yorkshire, due to the sheer drama witnessed by 7,599 fans at Brunton Park, and many thousands more across the nation on television in the final game of the 1998-99 3rd Division campaign. Having only stayed up by the skin of their teeth the previous season, Carlisle were in trouble once again in 98-99. Whilst many great escapes involve a brilliant second half or final quarter of the season, Carlisle's form from Christmas onwards was absolutely horrendous. Going into the final game of the season, they were without a win in 6 games and had won only 2 of their last 18. Yet they needed to secure all 3 points in order to leapfrog Scarborough and avoid relegation to the conference. With the scores tied at 1-1 in the 90th minute, Scarborough fans were already on the pitch celebrating when the 4th official indicated that there would be 4 minutes of injury time. In the 94th minute, Carlisle won a corner. Goalkeeper Jimmy Glass, on loan from Swindon Town and making just his 3rd appearance for the club, came up from the back. And you all know what I'm about to say. With the last kick of the game, Glass gave Carlisle all 3 points and secured his temporary club's safety. Scarborough were wound up in 2007 and their Phoenix team now competes in the 7th tier of English football. A stark reminder of what could have happened to either Carlisle or Hull had they been relegated that season. Unfortunately, it would be the peak of Jimmy Glass's career, and he had retired by the age of 27. Meanwhile, the man who oversaw Carlisle's survival in his first managerial role was Nigel Pearson, who, well, just remember that name. Crotone, 2016-17. From Carlisle to Crotone, and from Cumbria to Calabria, 6th place brings us to a region often referred to as the toe of Italy's boot. Far from Italy's most successful footballing region, Crotone were able to instill some pride in 2016, reaching Serie A for the first time in their history after finishing as runners-up in Serie B. For the first 3 quarters of the season, they looked woefully out of their depth. There's no other way of putting it. Following just 3 wins from their first 29 games, Crotone looked doomed with just 9 games of the season to go. Manager Davide Nicola somehow managed to keep his job, and with the team's fate appearing to be almost sealed, he promised to ride a bicycle 1,300 kilometres from Crotone to Turin should his team survive. Crotone lost just 1 of their last 9 games, winning 6 and pulling off one of the greatest miracles in the history of the Italian game. Going into the final game of the season, despite their miraculous run, Crotone still needed to beat 5th place Lazio and hope that Empoli didn't take anything from their game against an already relegated Palermo side. A first half red card for Lazio centre-back Bastos helped them on their way. As Empoli fell 2-1, Crotone won 3-1. Nicola fulfilled his promise, completing the arduous journey to Turin on bike, though sadly he was sacked in the following December and Crotone were relegated the following season under Walter Zenga. Having won promotion back into Serie A last season, Crotone are in need of another great escape this season, currently stranded in last place in the Serie A table, 8 points from safety with just 10 games to go, and 17th place Torino have a game in hand over them. Sunderland, 2013-14. Sunderland seemed to enjoy about a decade of great escapes from the Premier League, appointing a new manager in the second half of every season who would pull off the unthinkable before enduring a wretched start to the following season, being replaced by someone who pulled off another great escape, and rinse and repeat. It was really more like 4 seasons in a row than a decade, but I'm sure you won't mind me exaggerating for effect. Sunderland began the 2013-14 season under the stewardship of Italian madman Paolo Di Canio, but he was sacked and replaced by Gus Poyet in October 2013, with Sunderland having lost 7 and drawn 1 of their opening 8 league games. Following a festive renaissance, the Black Cats were mired in trouble again by April, sat 20th in the league without a win in 9. With 6 games of the season remaining, Sunderland were 7 points from safety, and their run-in included games against Manchester City, Chelsea, and Manchester United. It was difficult to see a route to safety for Gus Poyet's side, even if they could win their games against Cardiff, West Brom, and Swansea. But against all the odds, Connor Wickham turned into prime Didier Drogba, and the Black Cats went on a sensational run. Wickham scored 3 goals in just 5 games, Sunderland drew 2-2 with Man City, they beat Chelsea 2-1, they thrashed Cardiff 4-0, they won 1-0 away at Manchester United at Old Trafford, and then they beat West Bromwich Albion 2-0 at home. By the final game of the season, against Swansea City, Poyet's men were not only already safe, they ended up finishing the season in 14th place. A truly miraculous turnaround. Oldham Athletic, 1992-93. The inaugural Premier League season hailed one of English football's all-time great relegation escapes. In only their second season of top-flight football since the early 1920s, things weren't looking good for Oldham Athletic. With just 3 games in only 2 weeks of the season left, Crystal Palace and Sheffield United were mathematically the only 2 teams that the Latics could overtake in order to stay in the division, but they would need 3 wins from 3 to have any chance of completing the feat, in addition to one of those 2 picking up just 1 point, or fewer, from their remaining 2 fixtures. To make matters worse, Oldham's remaining fixtures were against title challengers Aston Villa, top 6 side Liverpool, and Southampton. No one gave them a chance, and Palace felt so sure of their safety that they did a lap of honour in their final home game of the season, in which they beat Ipswich Town 3-1. But Oldham went to Aston Villa and won before emerging victorious from a 3-2 thriller against Liverpool. Going into the final game, Sheffield United were safe, but Palace now needed to take at least a point from their final game or hope that Oldham didn't win, in order to keep their heads above the water. They were battered 3-0 by Arsenal at Highbury, but Oldham still had to beat Southampton to pull off a remarkable survival. Matt Le Tissier scored a hat-trick at Boundary Park, but Oldham scored 4, with a 4-3 win, completing what might just be the most dramatic final 2 weeks of a season at the bottom end of a Premier League table. Eintracht Frankfurt, 1998-99. Historic mainstays in Germany's top flight, Eintracht Frankfurt were relegated from the Bundesliga for the first time in 1996, but returned in 1998. Their first season back would be a chaotic one, as their form from the second half of November onwards completely collapsed. Eintracht needed to make up a gap of 4 points from safety in the final 4 games, despite having failed to win a single one of their previous 6 fixtures. The club went through 4 managers that season, but for the final run-in, Jörg Berger was the man tasked with keeping Eintracht Frankfurt in the Bundesliga. The first of the 4 games involved a journey to Werder Bremen, where Eintracht won 2-1. Next up was the visit of Borussia Dortmund, who were defeated 2-0 before Eintracht travelled to the Parkstadion, where they came back from 2-0 down to beat Schalke 3-2. Despite all those heroics, their 3 wins on the bounce looked unlikely to count for much. Relegation rivals Nuremberg had gone 5 games unbeaten, including a 2-0 win against Bayern Munich, meaning that in the final game of the season, Eintracht not only needed to win and for Nuremberg to lose, they also had to overcome a 5-goal swing in terms of goal difference. Incredibly, they took a 4-1 lead at home to reigning Bundesliga champions Kaiserslautern, meanwhile Nuremberg were losing 2-0 against Freiburg. In the 86th minute, Nuremberg had seemingly undone all their hard work, pulling 1 goal back against Freiburg, but Eintracht had one last attack in them, and in the 89th minute, they scored their 5th goal. Nuremberg, who had begun their day 4 places above the drop, were relegated, on goals scored as Eintracht survived in the most remarkable of circumstances. Leicester City, 2014-15. A great escape that is perhaps somewhat overlooked due to what Leicester City achieved the following season. I think a strong case could be made for the Foxes' 2015-16 heroics being the greatest escape of the Premier League era. On the one hand, I would say that I always thought this team had some talent in it, certainly more so than the Sunderland or Oldham teams that previously featured in this video, but they had an even larger mountain to climb than either of those two. Going into April, with just 9 games of the season left to go, Leicester were without a win in 8 games, having lost 6 of those games, and they were bottom of the league, 7 points from safety, and their manager was busy calling journalists ostriches in post-match press conferences. It wasn't looking good. The manager in question, by the way, was Nigel Pearson, who pretty remarkably features for the 2nd time in this 7. Leicester won 7 of their last 9 games, drawing 1 and losing 1. When the season ended, they were the form team in the entire division. Wes Morgan and Robert Huth were rock solid, Esteban Cambiasso rolled back the years in midfield, and Riyad Mahrez and Jamie Vardy showed glimpses of what was to come the following season. I must admit, I wish Leicester had just crashed and burned that season, because their resurgence saw Hull City relegated. But, credit where it was due. And not only did they survive having been marooned at the foot of the league in April, they actually ended up finishing 14th, a whopping 6 points above the drop. Fluminense, 2009. It was hard enough to pick 7 inclusions for this video, let alone ordering the 7 once I'd picked them, but there was no doubt in my mind that Fluminense's 2009 escape simply had to feature. Fluminense are part of Brazil's G12 or Big 12, and they are the 2nd most successful club from Rio de Janeiro in terms of both state and national championships. Their 2009 season was utter chaos though. The club signed 27 new players that season and went through 5 different managers throughout the course of the campaign. With just a third of the season left to play, it was reported that Fluminense's mathematical chance of relegation was 98 or 99%. In light of that fact, manager Cuco decided to mix things up and play some of the team's talented youngsters. It went better than expected. The fresh blood and Fred's return from injury saw a radical turnaround in form. Having gathered just 18 points from 24 games up to that point, Fluminense went unbeaten in their last 11 games. It was a run which included victories against Atlético Mineiro, Cruzeiro and Palmeiras. In the penultimate game of the season, Fluminense beat Vitória, a result which saw them leapfrog Coritiba and climb out of the relegation zone for the first time that season. Just to add to the drama though, their final game of the season would be against, you guessed it, Coritiba. Fluminense travelled to the Estadio Couto Pereira knowing that they had done the hard work, but the defeat that afternoon would see it all undone. After just 27 minutes, Fluminense took the lead, but within less than 10, Coritiba were back on level terms. The rest of the game was beyond intense, as the two teams battled both on the pitch and for survival. When the referee blew the final whistle, with the scores tied at 1-1, contrasting emotions erupted among both sets of supporters. For Coritiba, it was heartbreak, but for Fluminense, they had pulled off perhaps the greatest escape from relegation in the history of the Brazilian game. Much like Leicester City, having survived by just the skin of their teeth, the following season, Fluminense won their first Brasileiro title since 1984. So those are my 7. So many others could have featured and would have been just as worthy inclusions, such as West Brom 2004-05, West Ham 2006-07, Hull City 1998-99, Barnsley 2019-20, Everton 1993-94, Birmingham City 1982-83, Sheffield United 1990-91, Cagliari 1990-91, Tondela 2015-16, Fulham 2007-08, Borussia Mönchengladbach 2010-11, and Swansea City 2002-03, who staged a Great Escape very similar to Hull City's in 1998-99, avoiding relegation to the conference that could have signalled the end of the club altogether. Also, much like Hull City, the Swans then went on a fantastic rise all the way up to the Premier League, just like Hull City, just not quite as quick, but you know, who's counting? And to make it all the more balmy, the team that they beat in the final game of that 2002-03 season to secure their survival was none other than Hull City. Small world, eh? Anyhow, that is it for today's video, but thank you all as ever for watching. Give us a like if you enjoyed the video, makes a huge difference with the algorithm. Let us know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications by hitting the little notifications bell to HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter or Instagram, or indeed both, via the username at HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.